are moments when the story doesn't arrive at once. It builds slowly, piece by piece, name by name. At first, it was nothing more than scattered reports, individual cases that didn't seem connected to anything larger. A scientist here, a researcher there, a death explained in one paragraph, a disappearance filed away without much attention beyond local headlines. But then something changed. People began doing what people always do when enough strange details collect in one place. They start looking back. And when they did, the list began to grow. Not officially, not through a single confirmed document, but through reports, articles, discussions, and resurfaced cases that began to overlap in ways that felt difficult to ignore. 13 names eventually emerged in that conversation, and whether or not these are ever meant to be seen together, they are now. The earliest name often pulled into the larger narrative is Ning Li, a physicist who explored ideas that sat far outside conventional frameworks, particularly in the realm of advanced propulsion concepts and theories that even today remain controversial in mainstream science. Her career was marked by both academic curiosity and skepticism from within the scientific community. She existed in a space where ideas were constantly tested against what is already accepted as possible. Her death in 2021 was not widely discussed in mainstream coverage at the time. It passed without a kind of national attention that later cases would receive. But in hindsight, her name now appears at the beginning of the timeline people are trying to reconstruct, whether or not she was ever meant to be a part of it. Then there was Amy Eskridge. Her name didn't begin circulating widely until years after her death in 2022. On paper, her case was straightforward. It was ruled a suicide, and for a time, it remained in that category without significant public challenge or widespread attention. But what changed the way people now talk about her case is not just the record itself, it's what resurfaced later. A video began circulating again. In it, she speaks about her work and the resistance she encountered within her field. The tone is measured, but at the time, it carries a weight that viewers interpret differently depending on how they approach it. Some hear frustration common to researchers pushing against established boundaries. Others hear something more personal, pressure that feels harder to define, harder to place in a simple category of professional disagreement. There is no universal agreement on what the clip represents, but its reappearance has caused her case to be re-examined in a way it wasn't at the time of her passing. And because of that, her name has been absorbed in a broader conversation that didn't exist when she was alive. The scientific institutions enter the story. As the timeline continues forward, more names emerge connected to the well-known researcher environments. Michael David Hicks, who passed away in 2023, is one of them. His work was tied to planetary science and research that contributes to broader understanding of space systems. Then comes Frank Malwald. In 2024, connected to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, an institution deeply involved in aerospace and space exploration research. Both cases at the time of their occurrence were treated as individual events, documented, reported, explained within their own circumstances. But years later, they are being placed side by side with other unrelated cases, not because their details are identical, but because their fields of work overlap. And that overlap is what begins to reshape how people view them collectively. Another name that enters the broad discussion is Matthew James Sullivan. Unlike the others, his background is tied not just to scientific research, but to intelligence work. Reports describe him as having served in roles involving sensitive information in national security-related environments. His death in 2024 has become part of his expanded conversation, not because there is confirmed evidence linking him to other cases, but because his professional background places him within the same general ecosystem of government and defense-related work. And in narratives like this, proximity alone often becomes part of the discussion. By 2025, the number of cases being discussed began to expand more rapidly. Several individuals appear in overlapping timelines. Anthony Chavez, missing. Monica Janito Riza, missing after a hiking trip. Melissa Casillas, missing. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these names wrong. Steven Garcia, missing. Each case individually has its own circumstances. Each one has explanations being explored by investigators and reports through different channels. And when they are viewed together within the same time frame, people begin to see something that feels less like isolated incidences and more like clustering. Not necessarily connection, but proximity in pattern, profession, and timing. And that perception changes how the story is being told. In the same general period, other names appear in the conversation. Jason Thomas, whose case transitions from missing to deceased during 2025, Nuno F.G. Loureiro, a physicist associated with plasma research, also becomes part of the expanded discussion. These are not presented as linked cases in the official documentation. Each one exists within its own investigative context. But in the public conversation that has formed around them, they begin to occupy the same narrative space, and once that happens, separating them again becomes increasingly difficult. By 2026, additional names enter the discussion. Carl Grimmier, a scientist involved in astrophysics research, is reported to be killed under violent circumstances. William Neil McCaslin, a retired military figure with ties to aerospace research environments, is reported missing. At this stage, the narrative has shifted again. It is no longer just about past cases being re-examined. It's now about ongoing developments being added to already an expanding list. And that is what gives conversation its current weight. Despite how these cases are being discussed together, online spaces, news commentary, and compiled lists, there is still no single official document or confirmed federal statement that unifies all these individuals into one connective investigation. What exists instead is something more fragmented. Separate cases, separate reports, separate timelines, and a growing tendency to view them collectively because of their shared themes, fields of work, timing, proximity, and unusual circumstances, which raises a difficult question that sits underneath the entire conversation. Not just whether these cases are connected, but why human perception naturally begins to connect them when enough uncertainty accumulates. So the story at its core is still unfolding, not because everything is connected and not because everything is random, but because somewhere in between those two ideas is where most of these cases actually live. 13 names, 13 lives that matter on their own. 13 stories that, for different reasons, ended up in the same conversation. And maybe that's where the weight of all of this really is. Not in forcing every detail to fit together, but in the realization that behind every name on a list like this, there was a person who had a life, work, purpose, and a world that mattered to them. And now, years later, these lives are being looked at again. Not always with answers, but with a question that didn't exist before. So maybe the question isn't just what connects them, or whether anything does at all. Maybe it's simply like this. When something feels like a pattern, we are being shown something we missed, or are we being reminded of how much we still don't understand? Either way, the story isn't finished yet, and that's what makes it hard to look away. Have a good day, guys.